All right, oh God, what we do today is in this time of study, we want to focus in on your faithfulness and just allow that to be before us, to be in our thoughts, to be what we hope is a reality for what we live with and into. And so in this time of what we call applied learning, what we pray, Lord, is that you would guide us and direct us in all that we do today. And we pray this in your name. Amen. All right, so just a reminder, because we're in the part of the book where Tozer has, the first part of the book is about large concepts of when it comes to God, large attributes. And last week, or really for a couple of weeks since last couple of times I've been here, it hadn't been the last consecutive weeks, but two major avenues by which to look at all the attributes of God. One is transcendence, the other is immanence. One, transcendence means separate or completely, opposite of. Immanence means a part of, in the middle of. You can take attributes of God and put them on either side of this equation. So if this is the 5,000 meter view, then the 1,000 meter view is how we look at God and what God has revealed to us when it comes to things like power, space, knowledge, and God being everywhere, God knowing all things but not causing all things, God having all power according to things that line up with God's will, but not just all power to do anything, because then that would mean, would God lie? Would God, and the answer to that is obviously no. So this would be 5,000 meter view. This is a 1,000 meter view. And what Tozer tells us, it reminds us in chapter 15, is, and this is worth stopping for a moment and focusing in on this. Although what has been revealed, which is what we only know about God, what God has revealed to us. Can't know something that hadn't been revealed. We're part of the creation side, God's part of the creator side, and so creation cannot and does not know anything about creator unless creator reveals. What God has revealed about himself we call attributes. When we look at attributes for any level of study, like for instance chapter 15 has to do with the faithfulness of God, so if we single out one particular attribute like faithfulness, we always have to remind ourselves that we do that in concert with the whole, or in light of all the attributes. Anytime we take one thing out of context, and it can be in theology, it can be in Bible interpretation or whatever. I mean, it could be in a personal conversation. If you isolate a single thing and focus in on that as if that is the whole in and of itself, can be dangerous. And so Tozer reminds us at the beginning of chapter 15 that to keep in mind that for a correct understanding of what has been revealed is to see all of that as a whole, as a level of what God has revealed to humanity. And so there's this oneness in all the attributes, even though we might take a single attribute out and look at it for a period of time. For instance, if you take, what would happen if we only saw the attribute of justice, God's justice, and that would be the means by which we would study God and learn about God? What pitfalls might we fall into?
The person that did it, the way they did it, or why they did it, or how they did it. In other words, sometimes you might want to do it out of meanness.
Yeah, there we go. All right, you're touching it. That's lack of grace, lack of mercy. If it's all about judgment, then what that will create also in a person's life is legalism. And the idea that it's here are the foul lines. If anybody steps over the foul lines, annihilated. As long as you're in the foul lines, you're okay. what happens with human nature is that we realize that we have a problem staying in the foul lines. And so there is a level of grace and mercy that is needed. So if we just take one particular, or the holiness of God, same thing. If all it is we know about God is holy, and that's the only attribute that we focus in on, then there's other aspects of what God has revealed to us that get left on the sidelines, and that can lead to unintended consequences in personal life.
If we thought God was just only holy, then it would be fearful.
Sure, exactly right.
Like I can't go God, He's so.
That's right. So I mean, and holiness sits on this side of the ledger, okay? So one of the fact that God is completely separate than humanity, separate than creation, and creation can never get to God. If that's all we know about God, then after a while you either live with absolute shame and guilt because you can't get there, or you just give up. Why even bother? It's too, it's useless. You got the scripture lesson, be ye perfect because I am perfect. All right? Well, if you take that scripture out of context and you think nothing but on human endeavor and perfection, well, I mean, I give everybody about 2 seconds before they quit. And so, I mean, Tozer has got a good word here for us that reminds us that everything we look at, even in a study like this, we have to see it inside of the whole, or as a part of a unified revelation that God has revealed to us. Because what all the attributes that will eventually point to is this idea that God is consistent, which will lead us to faithfulness in our lesson today. So when you put all of them together and you look at things like His holiness, His goodness, His mercy, His love, the fact that He is all-knowing, all-powerful according to His will. I mean, what the Bible screams to the reader is that God is consistent in what has been revealed. Consistency in the fact that what God has revealed, that's what God always reveals. It's not like He reveals one aspect of it on Monday, and then 10 years later on a Tuesday you get something else. What you get is God's consistency throughout the ages. But if we take one out of context, then we could get in trouble if we're not careful.
Someone made a statement to me one time, someone that I would have known better, that God used to be mean.
Right, sure.
He changed.
Well, all right. So that's typical. I mean, that person's not the only one. Part of what you find and unfortunately, it's just people have not really immersed themselves in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So it's a conclusion that is drawn, not faulting the person, okay? It's just a conclusion that is drawn without full understanding of both Testaments. In the Old Testament, what people, they're familiar with certain aspects of the Old Testament, and for them, the Old Testament is judgment. When they get to New Testament, what they find is mercy. And it's this idea that God has evolved. He was old and judgmental and whatnot. Now He's new and fresh and merciful and gracious. And I mean, the first guy who put some put some teeth to that was a guy by the name of Marcion. He's a first century. He was actually one of the first ones to collect letters for the canon in the New Testament. And he taught to all of his followers that the Old Testament, the God is a God of judgment. That God is gone or dead. With Jesus, you have this fresh evolution of God. But he went on to say, and even that has passed because now we're in the time of the Spirit. And so you see this evolution of God from judgmental to gracious, and then now you get to gracious and filling with power and what have you. He's later considered a heretic, but I mean, but the thought behind that is, for so many, and even inside the church, is It's just a limit. It's drawing a conclusion without fully investigating both testaments. What you find in both testaments is a unity of thought. I mean, you find a covenant love, all right? So hesed is the word in the Hebrew that is used. The psalm, the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever. That's that word hesed. And it means like grace and mercy and goodness and everything that God is. That's what endures forever. But you find in the Old Testament plenty of grace and mercy, and you find accountability and justice. In the New Testament, you find plenty of grace and mercy, and you find accountability and justice. The fact that God is just means that there has to be judgment. You cannot be just and not have judgment. It's impossible. And so in the New Testament, I mean, you have full judgment of the world, right? I mean, pay attention to what Jesus said, right, in the Gospels. You have God's justice seen in Jesus Christ, which because of that then it necessitates judgment. You just find God taking that unto himself instead of passing it off onto someone else. That's cross and resurrection. So it's still there. It's just our limit. Whenever we draw those conclusions, we're only taking a piece of the information, and we haven't fully investigated both inside and the outside of Old and New Testament. But what you find, and Tozer helps us here, is we can talk about something as a single unit, but we see it inside of a whole. And when we look at the whole of the attributes, what we find is that there's consistency with God, or faithfulness, to use the word in chapter 15. On page 79, one of the quotes that I like of Tozer said, "God being who he is, cannot cease to be what he is, and being what he is, he cannot act out of character with himself." That's a great quote. So I've used different language. God, the reason why we say that God is faithful or God is consistent is because what God does is determined by who God is. Right? So whenever we talk about trust or faithfulness, often so if I came up to you and I said, "I want you to trust me," what's going to be yeah, right. Read the fine print. Yeah, I hear you. Go ahead. Yeah, Bitsy, you're just cynical this morning. I tell you what, so if someone else came up who has better character and says, "Trust me," what do you do? Normally you think of... Yeah, right. So, because we've been jaded, right? So, and that comes from where a person has said, "Trust me," and they haven't made good on what they've promised. Most of the time, when we evaluate levels of trust or faithfulness, the first thing we think about is not so much the person as much as the person's actions. So, if I tell Ruth, you can count on me to bring this to you on said date. She's going to think about other times, her interactions with me and what I have done, right? And if I've been faithful or if I've made good on what I've promised with my actions, then myself as person or character is trustworthy then. With God, it's the opposite. What we trust in ultimately, now we first might be introduced to God by what God does, but what eventually leads to trusting God, particularly when we talk about God's faithfulness, is not so much what he does, but who he is. Now just sit with that for a second. It's a little bit different when we think about people. I mean, what you ultimately trust is that, so when you say God, when we say God, we want to trust in what God says he will do, there might be an action that we're thinking about, or at least an action that we're hoping for, but what we ultimately think about or where we ultimately land is we're trusting in the nature of God. For instance, take forgiveness. How do you know that you are forgiven? Have you seen your ledger? Do what? Well, all right. So God says so. I mean, what you're trusting then is His character of what He said, right? So when we think about God, what we ultimately trust in relations to His faithfulness is that His nature is what it is. And then His nature determines what He does. Say forgiveness. But we haven't seen. I mean, how do you quantify forgiveness? I mean,
It's an inner feeling.
All right. Well, inner feeling. So you're still, again, you're talking about. You're getting back to His nature. I mean, how many sins have you committed in your life? I mean, so forgiveness. I mean, so seriously, if we're going to look at it in like a math equation, or if you're going to look at it in contractual language, right? I would, if I've committed, 1,000 sins, then I would want some level to know that each one of those 1,000 sins have been forgiven, because then that would put me in a state of purity, right? Or holiness, or whatever it may be. I'm just making up however you want to look at it. But since we can't do that, then what you have to do is, when we talk about what God does, forgives, what you ultimately trust in is that He actually will make good on what He says He will do, which has to do with His nature, or has to do with His character. That's what Tozer is getting at when it comes to trusting in God's faithfulness. Even though we trust in an action, forgiveness, what we ultimately are trusting in is really not just that act, but it's the being behind the action that says, I will make good on my promise. All right, now there can be a feeling that we have. There's assurances with that. I mean, inner feeling, Holy Spirit kind of confirming that we are forgiven. But we don't know, as in to objectively know, that here's Shane's book, and here's all the things, and and here's where it's been absolved. Right? So we trust in the nature of the one who promises said things. And so Tozer, again, what we see is consistency in God, and that consistency comes from His nature. Now, what makes it difficult when it comes to trusting is because human nature and God's nature are fairly different. I don't know if you know that. It actually is. And so when it comes to faithfulness, when we talk about faithfulness, even though we say that God is immutable, is all these things here, but yet when we talk about ourselves and our nature, most of the time we don't see it on the same level of consistency. In fact, when we talk about our nature, often we talk about our nature particularly in areas where it's incomplete instead of complete. Right? So when we talk about temptation and God's consistency, it's not an issue. But when we talk about temptation for humanity, it is an issue. Right? Because we're subject to things like what? What are some of the causes of our temptations?
Our environment.
Be more specific. Environment as in the weather?
The way that people around us have been brought up.
All right, so you have outside influences, right?
Right.
What else?
Our inner nature.
All right, inner nature, weakness.
Our interpretation might be different than.
Right. So again, that's still that outside influence. How about fear? Is fear a temptation? I would say it is. You got desire, the James passage, where it talks about where the root of sin comes from. Not so much from outside like the devil, that the real issue starts in the heart of the person. And there's that passage in James, excuse me, where it talks about it's like a lure. It starts small in the heart, and it sees something, and the same way that an animal or a fish, a fish would be an animal. That's real good, Shane. An animal sees something that is attractive, and it becomes fixated on it, and it lures them out or into a place to where there then becomes an action, and the action then leads to sin, and then sin leads to death. There's something inside of humanity. Genesis 3 is a perfect example of that. That sort of, when we think about our nature and the consistency of our nature, particularly in light of God's nature and the consistency in God's nature, that there really is a huge difference because of outside substance or things inside that can change and mar a sense of our character. And yet when we think about God, those things are not an issue for Him. Because, again, Tozer's right, God is consistent with His nature, which means that even with outside substance, they do not affect that nature as they would affect us. So let me stop, see if there's any questions or comments around that when we're just talking about the nature of God, the consistency of God, particularly when it comes to faithfulness, where our willingness and ability to trust in God's faithfulness, which is ultimately trusting in God's nature.
Does outside influences include influences from other people?
For us? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so the question was, when we talk about the struggles we have with our own character and our nature and how temptation affects us, other people, outside substances. There's an outside substance with Adam and Eve, right? I mean, look at this. And that object became, for them, the source of greater power, right? I mean, the issue is not the apple or whatever fruit it was. The issue is, whatever it is, if you eat it, you'll be what? There's the temptation. I mean, it's not the fruit. It's the idea of what the fruit could create or what the fruit would lead to for Adam and for Eve. And that never goes away. I mean, it's amazing. I had someone tell me one time, and I think I might have mentioned this to y'all at one point, every sin that is a struggle for a person has, at least in its the beginning of whatever the temptation is, it begins with something that's okay, or maybe even good, and maybe even good. God gives in the garden, so go back to Genesis chapter 3. In the garden, what the trees and the fruit represented were provision, providence, and to be enjoyed, right? I mean, all with the exception of one. And yet what happens is you take something that originally had an idea of goodness and provision and whatnot, and then you twist it and use it for your own endeavor, so that then something that is created that was not intended. You take, what's another temptation that people struggle with in our community, or not in our community, let's get bigger than that, in the world? We might think we're talking about someone if we say in our community.
Well, drinking.
Drinking, all right, so, or outside substance. So the issue there could be someone could use, maybe there's a pain that someone has, or a level of void or incomplete, and so then an outside substance becomes a mean for a pain reliever, right? Or it could be that there's something about the drink that tastes good or whatever. I mean, it's fruits or grains or whatever it may be. Again, it's something that is morally neutral, and yet it is then used or abused to such a way that was an unintended purpose, or maybe a misuse of it for something else.
I think it's jealousy, Tim. Sorry,
Sure, jealousy is another one. I mean, Yeah, you really see these in the 7 deadly sins. All right, so I mean, and or envy and jealousy being one of them. It starts out with something. I mean, the acknowledgement that something else is beautiful or good, and then and so or it even belongs to someone else, and then that because of what's wrong inside the person, what's wrong inside the person, then it becomes twisted, or wanted to be used in a unintended purpose or unintended means, and so then it gets warped, it gets polluted, and then it becomes something that can be very destructive to a person. But those things, when we think about God, or at least what we know about God, what has been revealed, those things are not an issue for God because of the consistency of His nature. But they are an issue for us because of the inconsistency of our nature. And the Bible, the Bible spends a great deal of time about talking about this consistency of God's nature, particularly around the issue of faithfulness. I mean, and covenant is probably the best way to talk about that in both Old Testament and New Testament. Because covenant is, this is who I am, this is then what I do, I make a promise to do something, and so then when I fulfill that promise, then that tells you that my nature is consistent, right? And so we see covenants all throughout the Bible. I mean, you've got a covenant with Noah, you've got a covenant with Moses, a covenant with Jacob. Obviously you see the apex of that, of those being made whole or being made good on with the giving of Jesus. And this is where Old Testament and New Testament are designed to be studied and read together, because you see culminations of that consistency, starting here and ending there. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. Just hold off to that, because we're just talking about what I'm going to do here when we break. So I'll give you some insight into what we're going to do in our lesson today. We're just talking about the theology of faithfulness. After the break, we're actually going to talk about how do we learn to trust? How do we move from, Shane, you're just talking about concepts about who God or attributes of God, and until they become first person. So let me just put a peg in that for just a second. Because what we have in chapter 15, now this is where Tozer, all right, so this is one of the critiques I have of the book. Tozer, he wants people to reform, to renew with this of reacquiring the vastness of God, right? It's the purpose of the book. He wants the reader to see the bigness of God again, and then be in awe, and then that lead to personal devotion, which is a great idea. The problem is he never gets past just this theological or large concept into making it into something first person. I mean, so that's my critique of the book, all right? So we can talk about God's faithfulness, but how do we trust in God's faithfulness? What do we do? How does that become first person, inside of our life? How does that become a part of our skin? It's one thing for instance, a conversation I have with my children sometimes would be, they would ask a question and I'd say, well, God is faithful. And then their response would be, all right, and what? And then what's next? I mean, I get that. God is faithful, but what does that mean for me? What does that mean for me in this particular situation? What does that mean for me? And because God is faithful, how do I process that in my life? Unfortunately, Tozer does not spend a lot of time in trying to get on the life view as much as he's just painting the picture of the vastness of God, which is great. That's his MO. That's his thesis, and I think he does an adequate job there. But every time I finish a chapter, there's part of me wants to go, all right. Yeah, I mean, you hadn't told me something I hadn't already, already know this. So let's get into the weeds of my life and how God's faithfulness makes a difference. Now, there is something good to remind us of these big ticket things, like remind us of God's covenants and God's faithfulness and God's consistency, because there are times where we really do need to hold on to that, particularly in areas where our life is very inconsistent. To know that God is consistent is very helpful. So let me stop, and then we're going to take a break because I need to print something out for y'all to look at for the second half. Any comments, questions, ma'am? Uh-oh. Well, that's yeah. We're kind of down today, so we don't have our train. You know. So, yes, ma'am. No, we did not. I know they're coming home. Is it Thursday? Is that right? Or Friday? Addie and Ann Norris.
She asked me to put Eddie on the list today because I think it's Wednesday they're gonna remove his T cells again, whatever that is.
Right.
And Thursday is the day that if he's gonna feel bad, he would.
Right.
And we don't want him to feel bad, so he can come home.
Did everybody hear that? Okay. I mean, there's three shots of the T cells. I mean, this is his third process of that, and then hopefully he'll be able to come home end of this week. Also talked to Lindsay Layfield. She just had a 3-month scan and that came back clear. So real thankful there. So all right, well, we'll take a break and we'll come back and then we're going. All right, let's go ahead and come back together. All right, let's go ahead and come back together. I want to introduce you to a couple of things. All right, so we've been looking at this idea of God's faithfulness, and Tozer helps us, but what we want to do is sort of get out of the clouds of that. And I mean, it's one thing to talk about God's consistency in His nature, but how does that play out into daily living? And oh, what happened? It's like the screen of green. Here we go. Oh well, y'all can understand that, right? You can't. I don't know why not. Yeah. There we go. All right. Let there be light. So this came out of some teaching with the staff yesterday. This Imitations of Christ. I don't know if you've ever heard of that particular work. What's that? Yeah. I mean, it might be a movie. Thomas à Kempis was 1400s. He's a German priest, theologian, Danish to some degree, I guess. And I could email this out. Don't feel like you got to copy it. And Imitations of Christ is his major work. And for many of the reformers, they sort of cite this as the seminal work. And it's a pretty long, it's 4 books inside of this, or 4 volumes, it's not 4 chapters, just 4 pieces inside of the work. And what Thomas à Kempis wanted to do is, how do you help people be a disciple, live a disciplined lifestyle? So I came across this, and I don't like the word manic depressive. Obviously, that's got a different mindset in our day and time. But what I do like about this particular quote, it's just a little excerpt of the writing, is it acknowledges parts of before the break we were talking about human nature compared to God's nature, and the struggles that human nature has compared to the consistency of God's nature. And just the acknowledgement that, there are going to be days that are seasons of life that are one way, and then seasons of life that are another way. If you want a biblical example of this, Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There's a time for this, a time for that, a time for this, a time for that. And so for our goal then is, how do we, in all of this, where there are parts of our life that seem to be all over the place at different times, how do we stay focused or centered and trust in the consistency of God's nature when there are times where our nature seems to be all over the place? Now, I think what's crucial, and this is what I love about Thomas à Kempis, is this phrase right here: the clearer your target, the better you'll be able to weather. And if you don't like the word emotional storms, that's fine. I mean, he's keeping right. He wrote this in the 15th century. Words are a little bit different. So the idea of manic depressive, the idea of emotional storms might not have the same connotation today. But he is talking about how their emotions do affect us to some degree. So, in light of what Tozer wrote in chapter 15, and the Thomas à Kempis, the acknowledgement that, and this guy's a heavyweight theologian, all right? So the fact that, I mean, he's recognized as a heavyweight theologian on Protestant and Catholic sides of the equation. And, I mean, John Wesley thought that every single person should have his writing in their library. I mean, he thought it was that important. So the clearer the target, the better we'll weather these storms. Tozer, I think, if we were to use chapter 15, would say the target is to trust in God's faithfulness in this consistency of God's nature. So here, now this is where, has nothing to do with Thomas à Kempis or Tozer. This is all Shane, all right? So you're about to descend down into the depths of theology. These are the high people of theology. This is kind of the lowest rung. But this is my thoughts on how do you actually learn to trust in this consistency in God's nature, in light of the fact that our nature can be all over the place, in light of the fact that our nature at times can be subject to outside influences, to personal desires that are still in need of transformation. In light of all these things that are struggles for us, how do we either have this clear target or how do we trust in the faithfulness of God? Here's how I think how. I'm still working on this. This is probably going to be a sermon at some point. So after you study it now, forget about it. And about a year from now, when I dust it back off, then you can say, wow, that's like fantastic. So, all right. I think the first thing we do is we behave, which then is talking about action. All right. So again, when we talk about trust, even though we want to trust someone's nature, whether it be God's or another person, we dip our toe into that by looking at the actions, right? If I came up to you and said, Ruth, trust me, you're going to look at my actions and determine whether or not my character is trustworthy. But you behave or begin with your actions, live your life as if there's never a doubt in God's consistency, or there's no other option. All right? So this is about how you act. And so if I'm in a day, if I'm not in the days where it's faithful, I'm in the days where it's faithless, sluggish, troubled, and I perceive as if there's a storm around me. So maybe the first thing that we would do, let me get a different color, is to ask ourselves, what would be the action? How should I act in light of this storm, as if there's no other option for me other than to trust God's faithfulness? So what would that be? I mean, I'm not answering it for you, but that's what you have to answer for yourself. And that's what you do. Whether you think it's right or wrong, easy or hard, doesn't matter. That's when you think about, what do I do today? This is what I do. Even if you would say, I don't know if I can trust this, even if I'm still trying to flesh out this idea of, is God's nature consistent? Is God's nature trustworthy? You probably can answer at least what you think you should do if they were true. You with me? All right, that's the first one. Second one, or in the process of that, retell the stories of, let me put, God's faithfulness. Okay. How many of y'all have ever experienced the Seder meal or Passover meal? All right? If you haven't, at some point in your life, you probably need to. It's a neat experience. One of the things that they do is at an appropriate time, always, every Passover, it goes back to the very first Passover, shows up in Exodus, is youngest person goes to oldest person, and they ask a question. It's the same question every time. Do you know what the question is? Tell me, or why are we doing this? Tell me again the story. And it is the story of God's faithfulness to children of Israel in Exodus. So they retell the Passover. Why was there original Passover? Why are we still doing this even today? All they're doing is retelling the story of God's faithfulness. Well, it has a tendency. All right, I hate to give credit here. This is going to be terrible. Oh, please edit this. How many of y'all went to the Kirby Smart Luncheon last Tuesday? Nobody went? Thank the Lord. This is like awesome. So, I'm glad I told it, So nobody went to a Georgia luncheon. Let's just stop for a second and sing doxology and just give. No. Anyway, Kirby Smart tells a story. What's that? 800 people did. What? That's preacher math. You know what I mean? So, how many people were in worship? Well, they said 100. I thought it was 1,000. So, all right. So, anyway, I thought Kirby did a good job. I went, and it was actually good. I'm glad I went. But Kirby Smart told a story about trust. Gosh, it's all coming together. Imagine that. And it's this story that he heard where a guy's walking down the street, or he's in a desert, and there's this well with this pump, and there's this bucket of water, and on the sign it says, use the water basically to prime the pump. Don't forget to fill it back up before you leave. And the idea is that would you trust that when you're in a desert, you don't have any water, this is the only water that you have, and yet the sign says waste the water or spend the water on the pump, and then you'll have all the water that you want, and then just make sure you fill it up for the next person. But the idea is, you're priming the pump. You're using something that primes the pump, because in priming the pump, then something greater will take place. When you retell the stories of God's faithfulness, it generates a desire to want to trust more. It's like when you go on an anniversary dinner or something. I mean, it's on one level, it's just one day to the next. On another level, it's fantastic and it's very meaningful. Right? It makes sense? Because you retell, you remind, you live again as if it is the first time. So first thing is, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, or maybe I don't know what I want to do. People say I need to trust in God's faithfulness. I want to do that. I'm not sure if I can yet. First thing I want to do is I'm going to behave as if it's not an issue. So my actions are going to be, I'm going to do the things that would be trust related. At the same time, I'm going to retell or remind myself, or if you're talking with another person, the other person about the stories of God's faithfulness. This is all over the Bible. I mean, you can't read Old Testament or New Testament and not see the retelling of stories over and over and over again. Well, as a Bible scholar or as a Bible reader, you have to ask the question, why are they doing that? Because it generates something inside of us when we hear them again. All right? So those are, you're doing both of these at the same time. At the same time, and these are kind of related, and this is why study is important, learn the covenant promises of God. I mean, if the Bible is the history of God's revelation to humanity, the faith history of God's revelation to humanity, then learn what it says. What are those covenants? What is it that is promised? Because if you're asked to trust in that, then it would make the most sense to know what you're asked to trust in. If it contains information about God's nature, then you want to know what God's nature is like. So learn those. Now, part of that, I mean, you're doing both of these at the same time. You're retelling stories, but you're also learning. Also acknowledge, and I think this is important for us, trust, this is what I'm talking about here, trust on anything takes time. Doesn't happen overnight. Now, we wish that it would, because we love instant gratification, but depending on the circumstance, often the greater amount of time might be needed. But while there's a time element here, you're still behaving as if it is.
So,
Sure.
say over a year ago, more than that, I was in the middle of something.
Sure.
That was no answer. And it didn't finish that way. It finished in a bad answer.
Mm-hmm.
The next year, but it's been more than a year now, it arranged itself to where you couldn't have thought it out better if you thought it out for 6 months before it happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Sure.
I mean, how do you, that took time. But,
It does?
But it
All
was
right.
also let go of at one time and accepted as is.
Right. So,
What does that mean?
well, some level that you're wiser now than you were 6 months ago or whenever it was. So when you read part of the retelling of the story of God's faithfulness, that involves a time element as well. So, and when you're learning about the covenants of God, they're inside of a context, right? So you have to see all of that as a whole. If you segment a piece out just at a particular time, then obviously vision will be skewed. All right, so the idea, if I look at, say, if you take those timelines, I'm going off memory what you said about numbers. If something that happened, a year ago, if you only looked at it 6 months ago, you had one conclusion. But now that you're a year distant, free from it, or separate, or behind it, then you have a different understanding because there's greater wisdom and insight and experience that has come from that. Well, when you do these two things, there is going to be this understanding. I'm going to use the word wisdom, a biblical word there, or knowledge, or whatever you want to talk about, where you are also processing differently throughout this time element. Now, one of the reasons why trust is difficult is because let's just assume this is the length of time that we're talking about, and you can subscribe to it whatever time. It could be a year, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years, whatever. If we stop at a certain period, then this is all we're able to go on, because that's the only experience we have. But there could be a greater work that's taking place. We're just cutting it short in our evaluation of it. Does that make sense? And what we need again is you keep behaving as if, and count on, as you're doing these, a greater wisdom that takes place in that process. But that's a good question, fantastic question. Now, all these you're doing together, right? So it's not like you do one, and then once you graduate from that, you go to 2, and then 3, whatever. You're doing all these at the same time. This is behavioral or action. These are more, they'll involve some action because you're reading and studying and whatnot, but it's more inside study, what have you. Acknowledging it has time, that's an inside thing. Now, this is both inside and outside, and that is pray. Pray for assistance. Pray for greater wisdom. Pray for, as you're retelling the stories, that you're gaining insight from the stories. As you're learning or relearning the covenants, that they become something not just objective, but they become something subjective. And so you're counting on the work of the Spirit to aid in all of this for greater trust. Now, what I don't like, Shane doesn't like here, is I can't quantify it because I can't put the Holy Spirit in a box. I would love to do that because then it would make even for a better sermon. Right? Just do these things. When you do that, it's going to get a ticket. You get the ticket, and you go over here and you give this person a ticket, and it's all going to be fine. But this is not up to me. This is up to God. But you do count on God to help in that process. You count on God to make the target clear. All right? So we go back to this faithfulness, this immovable God. When our life is moving over here, it is so important to have something that's steady, that's like an anchor that keeps you from moving off course. Right? When I was a boy, we used to go to the lake all the time, and we would take our boat out, and after we skied and swam and did all those things, often we just would take our anchor and just throw it out, and we'd take a nap in the bed of the boat during the middle of the day in the summer. And the reason why we did that is because I didn't want to go to sleep for 30 minutes or an hour and then wake up and I'd be up against the woods or on somebody's house or dock or whatever. We would just find a place in a slough, normally close to where our place would be, throw it out, and now the water would still move the boat around depending on the current, also depending upon if there were other boats coming by that might move us. But the fact that it was anchored to something at the bottom, the boat would not go too far. Right? Well, every now and then, right, it comes out. So, and then the last one is you need accountability. And what I mean by that is an accountability person or a community to help. To sit down and say, now Shane, you said you were going to behave, as if that trust is not an issue for you. You said you're going to be retelling these stories. Why don't you tell that story to me? You said you're going to be learning about the covenant promises of God. You even told me at lunch one day that it's going to take some time. So I'm here to remind you, as an accountability partner, it's going to take time. And trust in the fact that, at 6 months you have this level of insight, but maybe at a year you have that level of insight. I'm reminding you to be in prayer about this, and I'm in prayer with you. So you need a community. The Christian life was not designed to be a solo affair. It's not. It's always inside of a community. You cannot find solo believers in the Old Testament and the New Testament. They're inside of a community. And I think that's designed that way. The church, whether you like or dislike the church, okay, doesn't change the fact that the church is the means by which God has given to the world to reveal God's kingdom in Jesus Christ. So if you're a fan of the church, or you're unhappy with the church, or you don't think the church is doing it right, it doesn't change the fact of what's been designed by God. Now, we don't always get it right, okay? I acknowledge that. But the church is God's instrument of revealing God's kingdom, of what it's like with people. It is. That is all over the New Testament. Which means then to be isolated from that community is to ask something of your faith and even something of how God redeems. You're asking something of that is not its original intention. So the idea that someone says, well, I really don't need all that. I can do all this on my own. Yeah, okay. But it's like running on one quart when you're designed to run on 4 quarts. It might be a possibility. It is not the probability or the most helpful. And so we need accountability with people, which means we need a community. And it's easier to weather the storms of life, not only when you have an anchor, but when you know you have other people who are tied to that anchor to be with you. It's amazing how that works. There's all kind of beautiful sermon bits. I'm on a roll now. Those strands. You can take a couple of strings and you take one string by itself and you rip it without a problem. You put a few strings together and you make them into a cord. You can't break that. Well, why is that? Well, there's a number. There's power in numbers. And so we Western culture loves individuality. Evangelicals, Protestants love personal salvation. Those are all good. Those are all realities. The negative is sometimes we forget that we need a community.
I read all the time that as people get older, the less community they may be involved in, and the more detrimental that is to their even their physical health.
Sure.
It's very, very, very important.
Which is why if you go to a nursing home, and you go, do you know what one of the first things that happens?
Get better.
No? Well, you do. But when you talk to someone, they rub hands.
Yeah.
Because it's personal touch. And or in hospitals, people who've been in, or if they've been in monastics or whatever, if they've just been away from people for a long period of time, just by nature, what they will do is they will grab each other. And it's like it's involuntary. They'll start rubbing hands or touching. It's because we need that human contact.
Someone that you're friends with, but you haven't seen in a long time.
Sure.
They go away once you see each other.
Right. Absolutely. Here's something great. When the first time that Connor came home, I think after like a couple of months of school or something, he sat by his mother the entire weekend.
It's hard.
What they right. In the first night it was he sat literally by her, The second night he sat within proximity, and they binge watched this show that they both like. And but what it was, I mean, it's the desire for this human contact that is different than, in this case, what he got just while he was in school. But it's no different for all of us. Okay, so I mean, we all need accountability, which means we all need a community. And to be isolated or separated from a community, particularly when it comes to faith, and then when you throw in faith in time of a season that we would classify as a storm, it can be very detrimental and hurtful, because what we feel more than anything else is isolated. And then when you feel isolated, fear seeps in, and fear can be a lure or a temptation, even when it comes to trusting in God's faithfulness. What if He's not faithful now? Well, what is that? That's a fearful statement. And so, I mean, we need, I don't know which one of these is more important. I mean, I'm still processing. This is where I got yesterday, all right? So this is fresh on my mind on the press-wise of how that plays out. But I think these are the 6 components that lead to greater trust in just your life in general, but definitely lead to greater trust in a life in God's faithfulness. And I don't think, I mean, just right now, maybe I might be wrong, I don't think you take one of them out. And there might be another one I need to add into. I just don't know that yet. But I like Thomas à Kempis. I like a historical, theological heavyweight who agrees. There are going to be days where it's just not working, and that's okay. Because one of the assumptions that we have when it comes to faith is that with faith, we should always, we're overcomers, and everything should be grand and good. And the more we believe, the less struggle we're going to have in our life. I actually think it's the opposite. I think the closer you get to God, the more aware of your own frailties you have, which can be a little bit, that could be sort of haunting. I was not aware of my own sinfulness when I did not care about Jesus Christ. Now that I care about Jesus Christ, I'm aware of every single thing from thought to word or action. And a lot of times I even know about it before I do it or say it. And, so...
You get that little,
Well, I don't get a little one. I get a big one, But I think this works. And... Right. So again, we're looking at larger attributes, and they're helpful because Tozer wants us to read and recapture the vastness of God. Well, you cannot talk about the vastness of God without talking about the cloud issues, the big, large theological concepts or attributes of how God has revealed Himself. But going from something very large into something very small, or going from objective to subjective, requires works on our behalf. We're going to start something tomorrow that on Wednesday nights, I'm going to look at virtues. That's the classical word, fruits of the Spirit, maybe the biblical word, and how that plays out. Well, that is taking the big things and making it into something that's personal inside of our life. That's what the fruits of the Spirit are all about. You're taking what's been revealed about God, and how that plays out into your individual life. What does that look like? What does that feel like? How does that process in the world? And thankfully, people have already, we're not coming up with this. This has been something that Paul wrote about to the church in Galatians. And so we're going to look at some of that stuff. All right, any comments, questions?
These steps, to getting to understand God. I guess I'm trying to figure out if it's about just coming to terms with I don't know how to put this, about praying, about it just being God's will.
Right.
Like praying for.
Right.
Maybe putting your own.
Yeah, all right. So if you take out one of these, like you could take out prayer, and one of the debates that shows up, just from always and everywhere, and it's actually the same thing that came up in the Friday group. So I don't know there's safety in numbers, right? So the same question was asked by someone in the in the Friday group about when it comes to prayer and the idea of trust and things of that nature. Praying for God to move is all. There's two aspects of prayer. Prayer is that we pray and we want God to do something, which means the action is that God does it. Another part is that prayer becomes the mean for us to change our heart to align with, so the action is on our end, right? For God to move is where this right here becomes important. Because what we said about God's power, what we said about God's faithfulness, is that those are always in context to what His nature is. To pray for God to do something that is either outside or beyond what His nature is to ask something of God that God will not do already. Right? I mean, it'd be the same thing asking you to say, I want you to do X, and it's something that you've said you're not going to do. Then I'm asking you to do something that would be against your nature. Well, what is consistent about God's nature is that's not going to change. So knowing what God's nature is, and then also knowing what God's will is of utmost importance when it comes to prayer. Largely speaking, in the Bible, God's will is that people would know Jesus Christ, the redemption of God that shows up in His love and His mercy. All right? So that is the number one will of God, that people would know God's actions of salvation seen in Jesus Christ. All right? So that is the big, when you talk about big ticket will of God, that's what it is. Now, like when we talk about miracles and things like that, they are not the norm. Now, I'm not saying don't pray for miracle and don't pray for healings and things like that. They're not the norm. And there's all kind of ways we can talk about this. Jesus healed people, but everybody healed. What happened? So it's temporary. They all died. I mean, so it's temporary. And the best writing on this is C.S. Lewis. He wrote a book called Miracles. It's worth reading. But the thesis of it is that miracles do happen. They're just the suspension of the natural law of what God has created, and they're always temporary. All right? Now, on one level, we don't like that. Well, the reason we don't like that is because if a miracle doesn't happen, then there's pain involved, or there's grief, or there's an outcome that is not desired for us. Correct? Right? I mean, so if you pray for a miracle and it doesn't happen, then we're faced with the reality that we now have to live or adjust to something that we did not want to take place. God's answer to those things that we don't want to take place, He has actually already solved. Death and resurrection. Our understanding of that is just we cap it in a place where God does not cap it. And what I mean by that is, all right, so I pray for someone to be healed. They have a terminal disease. The natural law is that they will probably not be healed. Correct? All right? So what I pray for is a suspension for a temporary time, but at some point the natural law is going to come back into play. God's answer to the outcome of that natural law, which would be death, has He or has He not already cared for it? In what? Resurrection. Which means what? Death is what? Temporary. Now, we don't like it because our scope, go back to what we talked about earlier with Slade's example, we only want to take the slice out of this time period and not eternity. Right? I mean, that's somebody dies, we're grieving, we're pain, it's hurtful, and for right reasons, because we're looking at it from just this lifespan here of the time that we're with this particular person.
Because we don't want to be separated.
Absolutely, which is fine. But now God's answer to that is that you won't be separated, and death doesn't win in the end. The issue is that we just want something different than what God has already provided. I mean, it's kind of like I want to be winning at halftime. That makes me feel good. Right? Don't want to be behind at halftime because that means what's going to happen in third and fourth quarter? I'm going to have anxiety. But now, if you ask me, do I want to be winning at halftime or do ultimately I want to win the game, I'll take winning the game. But if I turn the TV off only at halftime, that's all I know. Right. This is halftime or whatever. I mean, it could be quarter one. Whatever example you want to use on time, that's fine. But God has answered all of that. So when we pray, do we want to pray for the suspension of the natural? Sure. But just acknowledge that's not the norm. And just because it's not the 1% doesn't happen, doesn't mean that's any indication of either God not being faithful or God not being loving, because God has already cared for it for all times. I mean, so the work of the cross and the resurrection is actually a much larger work than just an individual miracle. Because this is for death all. Big D, for everyone. Not just here. So part of our prayers, we pray for will of God, maybe suspension of the natural, but also the acknowledge that it might or might not. And that's not doubt. It's just a realization. And what we pray for is, so if this is God's action, the suspension, we also want to pray for our action, which means that our will, our heart would come in line into the greater promises of God when it comes to death and resurrection. Which is difficult, all right? Because we like this. I forgot who it is. There's this guy, it's a British poet. When his wife died, and now, of course, he has since died. It's like maybe 17th, 18th century or something. They're under their stone. It says, "We loved, we love, we will love." I mean, but now we like just we loved. I mean, that's and we're loving at this very moment. But I'm convinced that there's this whole world of possibility that we know and we believe in and we desire, but rightly so when we compare that, because we have not experienced that yet, compared to our known experience that we have in life now, this one is just hard for us to really get our heads around. And so our prayer would be for us to enlarge our sense of understanding and vision inside of the fullness of what it means to be part of this covenant love that is given in God. I mean, it's not easy. Okay, I get it. I mean, there's a reason why death is still the number one fear producer in people. But miracles are the suspension of the normal. They are not the normal. And that's not to say that God doesn't care about that. I mean, God has already revealed how much He does care about it in here. And it's taken care, once and for all. I mean, that's really a beautiful thing there. That, the 1 Corinthians passage, where, O death, is your sting? Where, O grave, is your victory? But thanks be to God who gives us the victory in what? In Jesus Christ. So when we pray about will, we want to know what that is. The large will is that people would know God's love and mercy in Jesus Christ. Outside of that, I think there's a lot of wiggle room, generally speaking. Ma'am? Oh, that's fine. And I have to go back and watch the video. And I'm a process thinker, which means I don't I think while I'm teaching and thinking, and which is why we follow some rabbit trails. And so I have to go back and pay attention to actually what I said. Of this, I'll be happy to print it, or I can email it out. And I can email you out this, which is what we talked about. That'd be helpful. I can't give you all the commentary. I don't have all that worked out yet. But hey, the good news is all this is archived. You can go back and watch this. It'll be up like today or tomorrow. And you just go to our website, spumccolumbus.org, and you go to media, and the first thing you're going to see is either the worship or the Tuesday morning study.
If you really get special about it, you can move it forward and get that.
That's exactly right. It'll be right at the very end. I mean, you can go back and watch years ago. I mean, we have this stuff going back for 7 years. And so all you'll do is just, you can, I mean, and we're trying to get to where it's good enough to where you could type in like God's faithfulness, and then multiple examples, whether it be from different sermons or different Bible studies, come up. But that's a long, we're like just a toe level in, because that takes a lot of work. All right? Yeah, I'm going to send y'all this right here. How do you trust in God's faithfulness? And then I'm going to send you this poem. If those of y'all who get my writings, my devotional writings on Monday morning, I'm writing about this. Not a little bit about what we talked about today. I mean, I've already submitted that, but that's coming out. So you'll get another dose of it on Monday morning at 8 a.m.
Did I understand you to say is the clearer your target, that the target is God? The clearer your
I'm sorry?
target.
Yeah, the clearer your target, the better you'll weather the emotional storms.
The target is.
Well, what I would say the target is trusting in the faithfulness of God, being anchored in that consistency. All right. Any other comments, concerns? All right. Well, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.